Welcome back to the nationally syndicated Price of Business Show. I'm your host, Kevin Price, talking to you about you and your business. Always love having you on the program. Batya Ungar-Sargon, you know her from Newsweek magazine. She's really all over the place on the media as well. I'm always checking her out and what she's got to say. I love her take because she is a progressive, and yet she's also one of the most, I think, eloquent critics of progressives. And so I like that about you, you know. And historically, I've always been considered conservative. The last decade, more and more libertarian. I'm very, I would say, strong libertarian at this point now. Not anarchist, but libertarian. And but for years I've been, I think, a very strong critic of conservatism. You know, it's part of the problem, I think, Batya. And before we get into the topic, but you know, I think part of the problem is that when you have really only two parties, the lack of competition and the war of ideas gets, frankly, pretty much obliterated by the lack of competition. It's ruinous. And I think that's a big problem both parties have. But before we get into that, I want to talk about your book, which I love. I'm kind of an evangelist for your book because it's something that resonates with people regardless of ideology. I sat there and I read it, and it's like, how do people disagree with this? And so, but why is this not more well known? You know, I had both that and the latter notion of why don't people understand this? And so, why don't you take a minute, talk about your work at Newsweek, but also about your book, which I'm a huge fan of.
And that is so kind of you. Thank you so much, Kevin. Yeah, I mean, the work at Newsweek I think is really important because we're one of the last standing that insists, you know, that a publication's job is to expose its readers to views from across the political spectrum, you know. We are very deeply committed to fighting cancel culture on both sides, and so we run political opinion from across the political, religious, you know, race, ideological spectrum to give our readers a really true sense of the great, you know, American debate. So I'm really proud of that and really proud of being part of that team. And we're really, really committed to the mission. You know, half of us are liberals, half of us are conservatives. We each run pieces that make everyone else on the team very uncomfortable, and that's the job, you know. So that, you know, I urge everybody to check out Newsweek. You'll find stuff you agree with, you'll find stuff you don't agree with, and you'll find really interesting, counterintuitive, and surprising takes from lots of different people that you would never even think about. So that's Newsweek. And then, yeah, my book, Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, is really about why our media is so terrible, basically, you know, how it happened that our media seems to have developed so much contempt for the average American, how our legacy media became so divorced from the concerns of average Americans. And just to give one example of that, Rasmussen had, they tweeted a poll about 3 weeks ago. They asked average American voters what their top concerns are, and then they asked journalists who worked at legacy media what their top concerns are. And Kevin, there was zero overlap, and I mean zero overlap. So the American voters that they polled said what they've been saying consistently for the last year, what their top concerns are. Number one, the price of gas. Number two, violent crime. Number three, inflation. Number four, the economy, right? Like, that's, every poll has shown that exact sequence, those exact top concerns of average Americans. When you look at the top concerns of the journalists, number one, climate change. Number two, the war in Ukraine. Number three, LGBT issues. Number four, January 6th, okay? You see here the vast disconnect between America's journalists and the American people. The American people are struggling. Crime is rising. The price of gas is 60% up. Historic highs of inflation, 9.1%. The price of eggs is up by double digits. The price of chicken is up by double digits. This is what Americans are super concerned about. No journalists are saying these are their top concerns because they are part of the elite. So their top concerns are these kind of like luxury concerns. They can sit around obsessing over climate change, obsessing over January 6th because they're not worried about how they're going to put food on the table and whether they're going to be able to put gas in the car. So I think that poll really, you know, it was such a concrete example of what my book is about, is how it happened that our journalists became so far above where the average American is at, and from that perch has developed insane amounts of contempt for American people.
Yeah, no question about it, and I think that nails it. You know, and your book, by the way, does a really good job of talking about the romanticization of journalism. You know, there was a time where, you know, journalists were, you know, really they were really average Joes who got joy out of finding the stories, no matter how far-reaching the implications, no matter who it might piss off, finding the stories that mattered to their readers. You know, they weren't necessarily particularly well-educated, not that being well-educated is a bad thing, but what they were was tenacious and getting to what they perceived to be the truth. And you and I both know the challenges of objective truth, but what they perceived to be the truth and really sticking to that. And, you know, I don't know when it happened. You know, I've heard it said before, and it may be a good benchmark, but it seems like what happened with Watergate, and Watergate was transformational, I think, on the role of media, I think.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, before Watergate, journalism was considered like a very low-status job. It was kind of like a high blue-collar job. It was, you know, most journalists didn't have a college degree. They were like, you know, they were blue-collar. They were working class. They lived with other working-class people, and that's who they saw themselves as, like, responsible toward, is, like, the little guy, right? You know, so, like, you know, for the kind of person who would become a journalist was, like, the kid in the back of the classroom who was always, like, cracking wise and giving the teacher a hard time and being like, how come you get to tell us what to do, right? Like, has real problems with authority. So he wouldn't go work in the factory with all of his other, you know, classmates after school because he was, like, really bad at listening to directions, so he would have been dangerous. So, okay, he would go become a journalist and drive people in power crazy, demanding accountability and justice on behalf of all of his friends who now worked at the factory and didn't have that opportunity to have their voices heard. Today, it's the exact opposite. The kind of person who becomes a journalist is the kid sitting in the front seat, and every time the teacher asks a question, they're like, oh, pick me, call on me, I know the answer, right? Like they go to elite universities. 75% of the interns that the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and NPR take are from the top 1% of universities. So you have a place like NPR that's just like supposed to be this liberal place, right? The forefront of progressive values, and all of its interns are coming from the top 1% of universities. That's how you end up with a newsroom that's obsessed with race and gender, that's super woke but won't talk about class, won't talk about the things that actually matter to the American people. Because if you take all of your interns from the top 1% of universities, you're going to end up with a very elite, very well-to-do, affluent class of journalists. There's just a total status revolution, and you're so right that shift started to happen around Watergate because it made journalism look super glamorous, and so suddenly, like, the scions of the elites would go into journalism. You know, someone like JFK, right? He worked on the Harvard Crimson when he was at Harvard, but he would never have dreamed of becoming a journalist because it was too low status for someone who was socially climbing at the rate that he was. But today, people like that increasingly become journalists because after Watergate, it started to seem like this very glamorous endeavor. And so when you had more elite people applying, they started demanding more money, getting more money, and then even more elite people started to apply. So there was a total generational overhaul, you know, of the kind of people who became journalists. And so when you think about it like that, like, you know, these people who become journalists, they all went to school with the AOCs of the world, right? They went to school with the Jeff Bezoses of the world. Like, they are in the milieu of the very people that they used to be completely outside of, demanding justice from. So now they see themselves as on the same side. There's class solidarity now between someone like AOC, someone like, you know, these congresswomen in the squad, or even these tech billionaires, right? There's class solidarity between them and the journalists who, in a different generation, would have seen their job as giving these people a hard time.
Yeah. You know, and you talk about how they don't want to talk about class, and the reason why, they are beneficiaries of class.
Yes.
You know, they're making salaries like the CEOs of corporations that they like to say they're going after. You know, not necessarily, you know, enterprise level, but large companies. They make large company-sized salaries, and yet they think they're for the people. It's an incredible disconnect. And I think you really nailed it. So let's talk a little bit about the media landscape out there. Who is really among the worst in this particular place, regardless of the style?
I would say, you know, so no, I'm happy to flag off the others, the competition, right? Local media is still quite, you know, the journalists don't make as much money. They're much more rooted in the communities that they grow up in. It's a lot less of this elite stuff. But of course, local journalism is a dying enterprise. You know, the thing that's actually growing is digital media, and digital media is just full of these overeducated elites. So you take places like NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, like these places are all catering to, you know, the 6% of Americans who are progressive, who happen to also be the most white and the most affluent of all of the Democratic subgroups, right? They're not catering to, you know, working class communities of color. They're catering to what white rich people want to read about, you know, when it comes to people of color, right? So the way that they talk about race, the way they talk about gender, it is all to like flatter the vanity of their affluent readership. And you take a place like the New York Times that used to be known for its even-handedness and its balance and its high, you know, the high standards. 91% of New York Times readers now are Democrats. 91%. I mean, they had to work really hard to squander their legacy to the point where only 9% of their readers are Republicans. I mean, that is they're probably not even Republicans, they're probably independent. That is a disaster. And yet, you know, they keep leaning into a lot of the stuff that got them there. Washington Post is even worse. You know, and that nexus of like elite, affluent, white consumer, right, being fed all of these vanity, you know, issues in a way that flatters them, but actually a lot of the times it ends up being, you know, a burden on the working class, the things that they're advocating for. And this is true whether it's defund the police or whether it's open borders or whether it's climate change extremism. All of this stuff flatters the vanity of affluent white liberals while acting as a literal tax on the working class that the Democrats used to represent.
Mm-hmm. So you would say the worst are some of the oldest legacy media are like the worst.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, there are places like Vox, right? You know, BuzzFeed. These places are like obviously like in terms of the content, they're even more extreme. But you look at the New York Times, and everybody that it's hired in the last 3 years has come from Vox or from BuzzFeed, right? Like it's poaching from those places, right? Used to be the New York Times would poach from like great local newspapers, right? You know, it would elevate those people, journalists, right, who had come up maybe under someone who didn't have a college degree and had a very great sense of news from this local sense. Now they're poaching from the digital media giants, right, which means that that's where they see the future. And so that has totally colored the kind of journalism that they're producing.
Now, talk a little bit, because I know people in both New York Times and the Washington Post, and I read the Times kind of religiously, and so mainly because of the depth and breadth. Very few publications, regardless if you like them or not, cover things with the same breadth and depth as they do. I read a lot of different things, so that definitely colors my views. But one of the things interesting that they complain about is how it is being forced to become more and more accommodating to the average reader in a way they never had been historically. Kind of differing with your opinion a little bit. And the reason why is because, let's face it, who could afford a subscription when the New York Times was just a newspaper? You know, middle-class people who liked smart stories would buy the Sunday paper, and that'd be about the extent of their exposure. Now, $20 a month, who can't afford a monthly subscription, you know, to the New York Times, a daily subscription to NewYorkTimes.com. And so many of their readers are unlike readers they had 20 years ago.
Yes, but they are like, 20 years ago they would get, a cross-section. You'd have a town that was half Democrat and half Republican, right? And you could, they would get a significant portion of both of those readerships, in the older generations. Right now they have all of these sort of young activist progressives, right, who are living in urban centers, right? And they can't afford to offend them, right? That's who they now see as like the base, just like the Democrats. And so they can't run Republicans. They can't even tell you how 75 million Americans are thinking and why, because that would offend the people that they are catering to.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Wow, we could go on forever. I really like this topic. You and I always have too many topics to choose from when we begin, when we have you on. And but I want to talk more about this. You know, I'm very interested in responsible journalism. It is so very hard to find. And, you know, I am in shock by the kind of things that I noticed just in the few years I've had a subscription to the New York Times, I guess about 5 now, where, you know, the things they apologize for are really ridiculous. And it's always an apology to the hardcore progressives. You know, and to me, it's like, sometimes it's their headline. It's like, really? I mean, come on, get some thick skin here. Running out of time, I'd love to get final thoughts from you as we wrap it up.
Final thoughts. Wow. Don't let them make you hate your fellow American, because that's how they make their money, and it's terrible. And we have to all resist that. That's my final thought.
That's a great final thought. They are in the polarization business. Just keep that in mind. Yeah. Hey, thanks so much as always.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin. Talk to you soon.
I'm Kevin Price. This is The Price of Business. Stay tuned for more.